at Harvard University with a concentration in culture, institutions, and society. Mr. Smith is a 2014 National Poetry Slam champion and a 2017 recipient of the Jerome Shaystack Prize from the American Poetry Review. His writing has been published in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The Guardian, Boston Review, and the Harvard Educational Review, and elsewhere. Clint earned a BA in English from Davidson College and is an alumnus of the New Orleans Public Schools system. Last week he was phenomenal, and he's going to get into some serious rabbit holes that he's going to take you down into, but it's well worth it. Engage when he asks you some questions. He's going to explain things in a different venue, and it's going to culminate everything that we've been taught today. So, welcome, Dr. Smith.
How's everybody doing? Good. Cool to switch these out. Sound all right? Yeah. Good. I am thrilled to be here, very excited. There are, I don't have to tell you this because this is who you are, but like there are no harder working people in schools. There are no harder working people on earth than I think school counselors. So like the work, just to start off, like you have to know that the work you do is so important, it's so invaluable, and you don't hear it enough. But like, seriously, you deserve a round of applause. I know the work you do is so often thankless, it is so often isolating. I taught at a school in Prince George's County where there were 2,000 students and there were 3 counselors. And so I know that unfortunately is not an anomaly in so many of our schools, and that so many of you are overworked, underpaid, but please believe that the work you do is so important. And so many of you work with high schoolers and teenagers, and so you know what's always fascinating about teenagers is I taught 10th and 12th grade English when I taught in Prince George's County, Maryland. And the thing about teenagers is that they like won't tell you hardly ever in that moment that they appreciate what you did. But like I saw somebody at like a Chipotle in Maryland that I taught, must have been 8 years ago. And this was a kid who never spoke in class, didn't say anything, always had a sort of like indifferent look on his face. And he came up to me while I was ordering my guacamole, and he said, Mr. Smith, is that you? I have a 17-month-old, so I have my son with me, and he was like, oh man, you're a dad now, this is wild. I just want you to know that you were an amazing teacher. I really appreciate everything you did. Like I love reading because of you, and I gotta go to work, but like thank you so much for everything you did. But like this is a kid who never said anything kind to me for those 3 years that we worked together. But it's just fascinating how, you know, but for the arbitrary nature of circumstance and me being at the Chipotle at the same time, my conception of like what that student thought of what I tried to offer to their lives would have been lost to me, and I would have never known. And so in those hard moments, just imagine yourself in a Chipotle with your students coming up to you and telling you how important the work you've done is, because it truly is essential. So, for background for me, so I'm a teacher, I'm a writer, I'm a PhD student at Harvard who is slowly but surely, mostly slowly, finishing my dissertation. And I always, when I talk to the groups of educators, I like to give this context because it kind of shapes like who I am and how I spent so many years thinking about this work. So when I first was entering my first year of school, entering my first year of teaching, I was like ready, I felt emotionally prepared. I was like, all right, I gotta do the things that are like gonna get me ready, get me psyched. So I read Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. How many of you have read that book? Right, you're on it. The other half of you who haven't, it's an incredible formative text, so important. Really gives it's a justice-oriented sort of pedagogy and a reminder of why we do the work that we do. Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And so I read that book, and I also watched a lot of Denzel Washington movies. Now it's just like, all right, I gotta get in the zone, get ready, get focused, And what better way to do that than to watch my man Denzel on screen? And so I show up first day of school. I'm sitting there, I'm 22 years old, beardless, I don't have glasses, I'm wearing contacts, and I'm wearing the school polo shirt and some khakis. So I really just look like one of the students. And so I'm sitting at my desk, or I'm sitting in the chair, I have my feet on the desk, and I'm just sitting there going like this as like all the students start to walk into like first period English, and they're looking at me and they're like, who is this creepy student guy sitting in the teacher's desk, rubbing his hands like this is weird. And then they all come in, they all sit down, and I very strategically placed a piece of chalk at the corner of my desk. And so I get up, I grab the chalk, I turn around, and I start writing poverty, food insecurity, immigration, mass incarceration, and like all these different things. Then I turn around, I throw the chalk very dramatically on the ground, and I say, this here, we're gonna solve all that. And they just looked at me, and they were like, Mister, where's the worksheet? Like, what is it? I don't understand. Like, what is all of this extra stuff you're bringing me? And it was in that moment that I realized that I was not Denzel Washington. And that I had to sort of recalibrate my pedagogy to match the world that I was coming up against. And part of what that moment did for me, more than anything, I think I came into this work, as so many of us do, because we care deeply about young people, and we often care deeply about young people who are coming from historically disadvantaged backgrounds. And so that was shaping, I wanted to come in and create this classroom of like young, politically engaged, smart, thoughtful, empathetic revolutionaries. I was like, I'm gonna come in first period, second period, we're gonna start a petition and a march going down to City Hall. It's gonna be great. And you go in and you begin to work with 15-year-olds, and you realize that is not, things don't happen as quickly as you would like on that front sometimes. And part of what I realized is that before a young person can understand who they are politically in relation to the world, they have to understand who they are personally in relation to the world. And I was an English teacher and a literature and creative writing professor, and so much of what I did were writing assignments that were grounded in attempting to help my students understand the people, the places, the conversations, the experiences that shaped how they think about, again, who they are in relation to the world. Because until you understand how certain things have shaped you and who you are and how you think about certain things, then it's impossible to understand how you would think about things civically or socially or politically, what have you. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And so just so people know, this is like not a traditional lecture. I'm also a poet, like I said, and so traditionally when people come to a poetry thing and people start reading poems, we think you're supposed to sit there and be polite. You're supposed to say, and then you do a little golf clap at the end. That's no fun. We don't do that here. If you like something, can I hear you snap? If you really, really like something, we say you do the delicious chocolate noise, and that's when you go, Everybody go, If you really, really like something that just moves you, you feel it viscerally in your chest, we say you do Jesus, but with a sh, because it's a secular space, so it's like, Jesus, and you fall over on the person next to you. But please check with the person next to you first. It's flu season. We don't need people even with issues. You know, that California weather can trick you into making you think it's not cool outside. And so part of what I think about, for context for me is I was raised I'm from New Orleans, born and raised. We got New Orleans in the building? No, I thought I heard a blue.
No, well, I just like Benny.
Okay, there you go. Well, that's real. I appreciate the honesty. A culture of honesty in the space. I always am like looking out for that because I love New Orleans so much. It's the place that raised me. It's the place that is near and dear to my heart. And the thing, I go and do a lot of speaking engagements and also do a lot of poetry readings and events. And the thing about when you go to poetry events is that like half the room will always be from Brooklyn. Like no matter where you are, and you're like, is like New Orleans in the house? One person might go, woo. And then you're like, is LA in the house? You might have like two people go, woo, woo. And then you're like, is Brooklyn in the house? Half the room stands up and they're like, yeah. It's just like, I don't understand the Brooklyn diaspora and like how it gets everywhere. So when I hear New Orleans, I cling on to it. And now you got me thinking about beignets, and that's all I'm going to think about for the next hour. So I was raised in New Orleans, and I was raised in a very mixed race, mixed income community. I had black friends, white friends, Asian friends. It was like the Disney Channel. It was great. We were like riding bikes with theme music playing in the background. Our hair was blowing in the wind. It's clearly their hair and not my hair. And my dad would always say, he's like, I love that you have such a diverse group of friends. That's why we sent you to school. That's why you moved to this neighborhood. But you have to understand that the implications for the decisions that you make might be very different for you than they are for your other friends. And when you're a kid, you don't understand that. When you're a kid, you're just like, you're the mean dad, you're the strict dad. Why can't you be more like Tommy's dad? And he's like, Tommy don't live in this house. And then he walks away very dramatically because he too watches too many Denzel Washington movies. And you realize this is really just a sort of intergenerational thing in your household, and that your mom really needs to throw the Denzel DVDs out because you and your dad are strange beings. And it wasn't until Tamir Rice was killed. Tamir Rice, as so many of us know, a 12-year-old boy who was killed in Cleveland, Ohio, shot within 2 seconds of police pulling up for playing with a toy gun in a park in an open carry state, not standing near anyone else. And so obviously multiple layers of issues to that case. And part of what that did was make concrete so much of the fear that my parents had and expressed for me growing up. And what it meant to be a young black boy becoming a black man in a world that often makes a decision about who you are before you have the opportunity to decide for yourself. And it, you know, now as I have a black son, I have a 17-month-old, and thinking about, again, the sort of intergenerational nature of that conversation, that the talk that my grandfather had with my dad is not so different than the conversation that my dad had with me, and it's not so different, unfortunately, than the conversation I'll likely have to have with my son. And what does that say about the world we live in? What does that say about the country we live in? What does it say about this sort of narrative of change and progress that doesn't always necessarily apply on the most sort of micro level? And I think that so much of what's happened over the last few years with regard to police killing unarmed black men and women sort of exemplifies how there's this thing that has been happening for a long time, but now because we have iPhones and the sort of ubiquitousness of technology, we can see it in a different way for the first time. So the short poem is about the experience of watching, thinking about the conversation that my dad had with me, and putting that in conversation with Tamir Rice's life. So as a qualifier, I used to memorize all my poems, and I was like hip and like going to the open mic, poems memorized just after I wrote them. And then I had a child. And now there's, as I'm sure some of you know, like when you have a kid, there's just like all of the space in your, like you had all this memory and all this capacity, and then it kind of just disappears into the wind. And you're just like, I mean, I used to be able to remember so much, and now I'm like, well, I don't know what did I have for breakfast? I don't remember. So that's to say that I used to make fun of people who like read poems off of iPads. I'd be like, oh, you're so lame. And now here we are. So if I stumble, just keep snapping and be like, it's okay, Clint. I too have had a toddler, and you know, half the reason I come to these things is so I can get a free night in a hotel. And so I will be asleep at 8 o'clock tonight, but yeah, I'm excited about that. One night when I was 12 years old, on an overnight field trip to another city, my friends and I bought super soakers, turned the hotel parking lot into our own water-filled battle zone. We hid behind cars, running through the darkness that lay between the street lanes. Boundless laughter ubiquitous across the pavement. But within 10 minutes, my father came outside, grabbed me by my forearm, and led me into our room with an unfamiliar grin. Before I could say anything, tell him how foolish he made me look in front of my friends, he derided me for being so naive, looked me in the eye, fear consuming his face, and said, son, I'm sorry, but you can't act the same as your white friends. You can't pretend to shoot guns. You can't run around in the dark. You can't hide behind anything other than your own teeth. I know now how scared he must have been, how easily I could have fallen into the empty of the night, that some man will mistake this water for a good reason to wash all of this away. These are the sorts of messages I was inundated with my entire life. Always keep your hands where they can see them. Don't move too quickly. Take off your hood when the sun goes down. My parents raised me and my siblings in an armor of advice, an ocean of alarm bells so someone wouldn't steal the breath from our lungs, so that they wouldn't make a memory of this skin, so we could be kids, not casket or concrete. And it's not because they thought it would make us better than anyone else. It's simply because they wanted to keep us alive. All of my black friends were raised with the same message. The talk given to us when we became old enough to be mistaken for a nail ready to be hammered to the ground, when people made our melanin synonymous with something to be feared. But what does it do to a child? To grow up knowing that you cannot simply be a child, that the whims of adolescence are too dangerous for your breath, that we cannot simply be curious, that we are not afforded the luxury of making a mistake, that someone's implicit bias might be the reason you don't wake up in the morning. But this cannot be what defines us. Because we have parents who raised us to understand that our bodies weren't meant for the backside of a bullet, but for flying kites and jumping rope and laughing until our stomachs burst. We had teachers who taught us how to raise our hands in class and not just to signal surrender, that the only thing we should give up is the idea that we aren't worthy of this world. So when we say that Black lives matter, it's not because others don't. It's simply because we must affirm that we are worthy of existing without fear, when there are so many things that tell us we are not. I want to live in a world where my son will not be presumed guilty the moment he is born, where a toy in his hand isn't mistaken for anything other than a toy. And I refuse to accept that we can't build this world into something new, someplace where a child's name doesn't have to be written on a t-shirt or a tombstone, where the value of someone's life isn't determined by anything other than the fact that they had lungs. A place where every single one of us can breathe. So this always happens, and I saw something like half of y'all. So you snap during the poem, and you clap after the poem. If you snap after the poem, it turns into like a weird 90s R&B video, and that's not quite the vibe we're going for. What's interesting is, so you all are here and you're talking a lot about equity, you're talking a lot about what it means to do this work on behalf of students who again have been historically disadvantaged through no fault of their own, and in communities that have been historically sort of plundered through public policy. And I think what happens is that we don't ground the conversation in that enough. We'll have these moments where we'll say we need to have a conversation around the achievement gap, or we need to have a conversation around race, we need to have a conversation around race and education, or we need to have a sort of national, whether it be on a national or community or school-based level, and we don't historicize that conversation enough. We say we need to talk about these things, but we don't put these things in historical context. And I think there are lots of different ways to think about that, and part of the reason that, it's important is because you can't understand the sort of contemporary landscape of inequality unless you understand the decades and decades of specific things that have happened that created the world that we live in today. And so I think it goes back to our founding, right? You can think about, an example I think about is Thomas Jefferson. And so Thomas Jefferson, what we're taught, and what I was taught in my K-12 education, he is the intellectual founding father of this country. He is responsible for the conception of the Declaration of Independence. He helped to write the Constitution. He is seen as the intellectual founding father of this nation, the paragon of our ideals. He represents the best of our national aspirations. But what I wasn't taught, and what I learned later, many years later when I read his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, is in it. He says very explicitly, he says, Black people are inherently inferior to white people in both endowments of body and mind. And he says the slave is incapable of love, and the slave is incapable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. He writes about Phyllis Wheatley, who was largely considered to be the first published African-American poet in the history of the United States. He's like, well, Black people don't possess the intellectual or emotional capacity with which to create art. So we can call this something else, but we can't call it poetry because Black people do not possess the necessary intellectual acumen with which to create beautiful things. And I think about that, and I think about how that's a version of Jefferson that I was never taught. And I think about how Jefferson is in many ways a microcosm for the idea that in the United States that we are so committed to the idea of American exceptionalism that we inevitably suppress anything that makes us look unexceptional. And part of what happens as a result of that is we begin to tell sort of very limited, narrow stories about who we are and how we arrived at this moment. And it's not just Jefferson, this is something that happens throughout history. You could think about Brian Stevenson, who's an activist and attorney in Alabama, has an incredible book, Just Mercy. He always talks about how we look back at the civil rights movement like it was this 3-day festival, right? So it's like day 1, Rosa sat down on a bus. Day 2, Martin had a dream. Day 3, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King were passing out cotton candy and lemonade. Everybody could vote. We sang Kumbaya and did the electric slide. right? Like that is how most people think about what the civil rights movement was in its essence. But what happens is when you make a caricature of a movement, you inevitably make a caricature of the people within those movements, right? So Martin Luther King, Martin Luther King Day comes around and everybody wants to put like a Martin Luther King Day quote on their Facebook, on their Instagram. You have people whose policies as politicians run ideologically counter to everything that Dr. King stood for, sort of decontextualizing who he was and using one line out of one speech on one day to reflect and sort of propagate their own ideological missions without accounting for the sort of larger legacy of Dr. King, who was someone who wanted to profoundly redistribute wealth, who was against the war in Vietnam, who called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the history of the world, who was deeply anti-imperialist, who had strong critiques about capitalism, but that often doesn't fit into the sort of narrative that we've created around a teddy bear version of Dr. King, where it's like, oh, he just said, everybody be nonviolent, we marched when we had a permit, and everything was cool. But what happens is when we teach our students and sort of propagate these lessons to them is that they fundamentally misunderstand how social change happens. And so then Colin Kaepernick takes a knee, or Black Lives Matter activists walk across a bridge, and people are like, I don't understand how they're doing this. Dr. King would never walk across a bridge. This is ridiculous. He would never allow such that form of activism to happen. That's not what he stood for. And it's like the movie Selma just came out, right? Literally, it is premised on activists during the civil rights movement walking across a bridge to make their point. But like this is reflective of the sort of ahistoricism that we have about how change happens. And it's not, I gave these two examples, but you can also think about, there's a study from the Southern Poverty Law Center that came out last year, and it showed that only 8% of US high school seniors were able to identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. 8%. The other 92% said states' rights and tariffs and the economy. And as a side note, like if you say the economy, you're actually correct, right? But what you're correct in saying that it was the economy if you understand that in 1860, the 4 million black slaves were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined, right? The single greatest asset that the United States has ever had, single most valuable asset that cannot be disentangled from the reason the United States exists as a global economic superpower today, just like empirically. But what happens is that things like slavery, we think about and project this sort of politicized or ideological bent onto them. And then teachers are afraid to talk about it. Teachers are afraid to address it. Teachers are afraid to think about it. And I think the danger of that is that then students are allowed to continue with narratives that don't help them understand why the country looks the way that it does today. And I always give this timeline because I think it's really important. But like the first slaves came here in 1619. Emancipation Proclamation happened in 1863. Civil War ended in 1865. Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act were 1964 and 1965. So it's only been about 50 years in which black people in this country have even had a semblance of legal and legislative freedom. For 350 years prior to that, it was fundamentally legal to discriminate against, dehumanize, delegitimize, disenfranchise black people. Not in an interpersonal, somebody being mean and using the N-word, but you are a state-sanctioned second-class citizen, if a citizen at all. And when you think about that, if you kick somebody for 350 years, and then you stop kicking them for a seventh of the amount of time that you spent kicking them, it would be both morally and intellectually disingenuous to then look at that group of people and be like, what's wrong with you? Why don't you have the same academic outcomes? Why don't you have the same economic outcomes? Why is there so much poverty in your community? Why is there so much violence in your community? Right, but this is the ahistorical conversation that we have around issues of inequality and injustice every single day in this country, where we're not grounding it in this sort of longer arc of history to understand why the reason that one part of California looks one way and another part of California looks another way is not at all reflective of the people in those communities, but instead is often reflective of things that have been done to those communities over generation after generation after generation. And if we're not giving our students the tools with which to better understand the social conditions they find themselves in, then they end up sort of internalizing a pathology about who they are, about like a pathology around immigrants, a pathology around black and brown children, a pathology around poverty, and begin to think that they are somehow responsible, or the people who look like them are responsible, or people who come from where they come from are responsible for the social conditions that they find themselves in, instead of this like intergenerational project, which is taking resources from certain communities and giving them to others. Like that is so, so important. And the example that I give that I think exemplifies this is the New Deal. Right, the New Deal is what I was taught in my K-12 education, again, was the single greatest catalyst to wealth in the 20th century. It has created the Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing, mortgages, healthcare, and that it lifted millions of people from poverty into the middle class, which is true. But what's also true, and what I didn't learn, is that black people, specifically black people in the South, weren't afforded access to the benefits that the New Deal provided. Right, so black people didn't have access to Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing, mortgages, healthcare, the GI Bill, literally the economic foundations of wealth over the course of a century. And you give it to one group of people, and you don't give it to another group of people, and then people act surprised generations later when there are disparate outcomes along lines of race, when the public policy and the social welfare benefits were extended on the basis of race. And so I think that these are really important things to understand as we sort of, help our students make sense of the world that they're living in. And I think it's important for us to understand not only like pedagogically, but I think it shapes. I remember when I started to learn this stuff, it like really reframed how I thought about my students. Like I came in with a lot of empathy. I came in thinking I was like a thoughtful person. But I think when you have the opportunity to remind yourself, like why a student might not be paying attention in class, or why his parents or her parents work multiple jobs that lead to him having to take care of their siblings, that lead to him possibly not being having great grades because they don't do their homework, because they go and they have to work another job, or they have to cook, or they have to do all these things. When you realize that these are not like anecdotal anomalies, but that this is instead reflective of things that have happened to like a wide range of people over years and years and years, then I think you begin to think about it a little bit differently. So this is a poem that is thinking about, something that's important that I always told my students was that in this country we have such a specific way of thinking about why certain populations are healthy and why certain populations aren't. And for me, I think it's really important to remind my students that like the reason that your community is filled with Chinese takeout, 7-Elevens, and donut shops, and not grocery stores that actually have healthy food, is because there have been decisions made in terms of like how your communities are structured that are made from people who are outside of your community, right? So the history of redlining and housing discrimination made it so that certain zoning policy made it so that certain grocery stores or certain types of businesses couldn't build in certain communities and could build in others. And it meant that certain people who even had the means to leave certain communities couldn't leave because they were prevented from getting access to a bank loan that would have allowed them to move into a different neighborhood that might have prevented a different, or allowed for a different type of upward mobility. But I do this thing where I like get on these like weird historical tangents and talk too much, but I gotta remember to do poems. And so, so this is a poem that's thinking about that idea and how that shaped, how the history of housing discrimination shapes what food insecurity in the lives of our students look like. As a child, my father would tell me stories of ancient Egyptian warriors, traveling for endless days and nights across infinite desert plains, showing signs of endurance and bravery I could only dream of emulating. He would tell me that upon their return home, these warriors would be welcomed with a feast worthy of their bravery on the battlefield. Years later, as a teacher in Greater Washington, D.C., I too now find myself traversing a desert, though it is not the one I envisioned. A food desert is categorized as a poor urban area where residents cannot afford or are not given access to healthy foods and grocery stores. Every day at 2:45, I watch my students hop onto the sleeping submarine of a school bus, every block bringing them deeper into an ocean where the only fish they find are fried, where fruits and vegetables are playing an everlasting game of hide and go seek because there are no grocery stores here. Just liquor stores and Popeyes, Dunkin' Donuts and 7-Eleven's children born into a neighborhood that feels more pollution than solution. It is then I realize that I am not too far from the deserts I once dreamed of. See, whether Anacostia or the Sahara, it doesn't make much difference because of these grocery stores. Southeast DC is no different than the Serengeti. To them, brown-skinned little boys like my students are nothing more than walking cacti, just a piece of scenery this world has taught everyone to stay away from. Brianna literally has a landfill in her backyard, so she has a hard time convincing herself the world doesn't just think she's trash. Restaurants come and dump the remains of food she'll never be able to afford to eat 3 steps from her back door. Jose eats fast food 5 days a week because his mother works 3 jobs to take care of 6 kids and only sees her son when she arrives home from work at the same time he's leaving for school, where he has gotten so big that the excess fat bunkered beneath his skin puts added pressure on his joints. His knees are literally crumbling under the weight of this world. Olivia watched her father shot 2 feet from her front porch. She wants nothing more than to go outside and play at the park after school, but gun violence has made a merry-go-round feel more like Russian roulette, so she doesn't go outside. Simply eats any processed food from the cabinet that will last long enough to prevent her from leaving the house too often. These are my students, my warriors, fighting a battle against an enemy they cannot clearly see. These kings and queens meant to feast, not to fester, but their zip code has already told them that their life expectancies are 30 years shorter than the county 7 miles away. I can see the fault of my own ancestry shaking in their eyes. Diabetes and high blood pressure run to the roots of my family tree. Heart disease is as much a part of my history as shackles and segregation. So from my father's kidney transplant to Olivia's asthma, these things are more than mere coincidence. Both grew up in places more accustomed to gunshots than gardens, so tell me place doesn't matter. That the neighborhoods that are predominantly wealthy aren't the same ones that are predominantly healthy, because when you're not choosing between buying your medicine and your groceries, health doesn't have to be a luxury. It doesn't have to be an abstract concept presented in academic journals and policy briefs. My students overcome more every day than I will in my lifetime. They are the roses that grew from the concrete, the budding oasis in the heart of the desert, and their lives are worth far much more than the things that this world has fed them. And so this is a poem that's kind of extending off of something I mentioned before about the New Deal. There's a great book for the history nerds in you called When Affirmative Action Was White, written by Ira Katz-Nelson, who's a historian and political scientist at Columbia University. So When Affirmative Action Was White, and sort of talks about the way that we discuss affirmative action. And his name's Ira Katz-Nelson, I-R-A Katz-Nelson, K-A-T-Z Nelson. And talks about the way that we talk about affirmative action today, and people be like, oh, certain groups don't deserve affirmative action, that's reverse racism, and says that conversation is ahistorical and doesn't account for all of the different types of affirmative action that white Americans have gotten in this country for generations, right? In which, you know, the very, as I kind of mentioned before, Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing mortgages, healthcare, the things that are literally, any social scientist will tell you, the economic foundation of this country and of upward mobility in this country, that so many people weren't given those access to those benefits while so many others were. And this is a poem that I wrote thinking about what Katz-Nelson was talking about in the New Deal, and just reflecting on what it means to have done that, and then to continue to blame these groups of people for living in the social conditions that they do. Because that's what we do in this country all the time, is we commit metaphorical and physical and economic and social violence against different groups of people, and then we blame those people for the conditions they find themselves in and say that it's their fault. And I can think of no more dishonest, egregious, insidious practice that continues to happen every single day in this country. In 1932, the Great Depression had taken America by the throat and rendered it an alchemy of dust and rations. The country had been decimated by a market that could no longer hold up a history of hypocrisy, and it crashed like something that's never before known what it meant to fall. In response, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed a series of legislative acts designed to lift the country from its knees. The laws transformed the economy and are responsible for the foundation that created the contemporary middle class. In the 1930s, 75% of Southern black folks were either maids or farm workers. In the 1930s, the only workers who didn't qualify for the benefits of the New Deal were maids and farm workers. I was told you can only call something a coincidence if it wasn't done on purpose. A coincidence is texting with a friend and then running into them at the grocery store. A coincidence is showing up to the office in the same new shirt as your coworker. A coincidence is walking past a vending machine and finding some quarters in your pocket. Taking away all federal benefits from an entire demographic of people feels like we should call it something different, something a little more honest, something a little more empirically grounded. But see, the thing about racism in America is that if you don't call it racism, people think it isn't there. It's the shadow no one can see when it is standing right behind you. It's the carbon monoxide killing you in a room where there is no smoke. 1 million black folks end up in prison and people shrug and ask what happened. An unarmed man is shot by police when he is running in the opposite direction and people call it self-defense. Interstate highways are built to black communities and people suddenly can't explain why all the businesses have failed. If you take away Social Security, minimum wage protection, housing, mortgages, and healthcare, you don't get to then turn around, see poverty, and act like you're surprised. How can you take the water from a fish tank and not expect the fish to suffocate, to gasp for its life, to flap violently against the surface while you watch from the other side of the glass? When a fish dies from having no water, do we call that a coincidence? If you block the sun from reaching a tree, do you have to ask why it doesn't grow? The government won't give you a loan to buy a house in a better neighborhood, then they blame you when your son gets shot. The city never built a hospital on your side of town, and they tell you it's your fault that the cancer spread. They stuff you into public housing, then tear it down and ask why all the schools are empty. If we didn't say it directly, you can't blame us when it happens. If we continue to keep our eyes shut, it can't be our fault that we don't see you. But see, this country is only able to whisper the words American exceptionalism because we're so good at covering our ears while someone else is screaming. So, in Prince George's County in Maryland, I had a large population of undocumented students. And that was not something that I didn't know a lot of people who were openly undocumented in my life before. They very well could have been undocumented, but it was also a different political moment with different social and political implications. And so they may have stayed in the proverbial shadows. And what's interesting, I talked a little bit a while ago about the talk that Black parents have with their kids. And it wasn't until that I started working with my undocumented students that I thought about like all the different iterations that the talk looks like in different communities. And I was thinking, we did so many writing assignments, and I was thinking about my undocumented students and my students from mixed status families writing these stories about how when they were like 8, 9, 10 years old, their parents sat them down and said, if ICE comes and shows up at our house, then you could go through the back door, take the key under the flower, the flower vase, go to your aunt's house. If ICE calls, don't say you don't know who we are. It's just like almost a fire drill for like a child about what to do if someone in their family is deported or is arrested to be presumably deported. And I think about the fear that a child carries to like literally go home every day and not know if a member of your family will be there. To go home and not know if your mother will be there, or your father, or your brother, or your sister, or your aunt, or your uncle. And what does it mean for us to expect a kid to like pay attention while I'm teaching Shakespeare when there's like so much of this other stuff that's sitting there? And that's not to say that we shouldn't continue to hold students accountable. That's not to say that we shouldn't continue to like make sure that they are doing their best to overcome certain circumstances. But we have to acknowledge the circumstances in the first place. And I think so often what we do in schools is we have this thing where we think that classrooms and schools need to be apolitical spaces, and they don't account for the fact that our students' lives are affected by political decisions every single day. And there's a fundamental difference between indoctrinating a young person with your views and giving young people the tools and the information with which to make informed decisions about the world they live in. And I think we have to do a really important job of disentangling that. I think even from your perspective, I haven't been a counselor before, but I think about what it means. What does it look like to acknowledge for a young person, or to look at somebody and say, like, I know that there's this other stuff, and just like the acknowledgement that and the sort of affirmation that can provide, and the way that can make a young person feel seen in a way that they might not have felt seen before. What does it mean to provide a young person with resources to make sense of the conditions that they find themselves in? And I think that that's something that our schools so often fail to do. And there are many schools that are doing it, but I think at scale, that's something I think about. And so it's interesting, and I struggled with it my entire experience working with this group of young people. And I wrote this poem. I'm gonna do something a little bit different. I've been trying to do this, but like I wrote this poem in 2012, my second or third year teaching. And I'm going to do something. Sometimes poets or writers have this thing where we look back at the old pieces of art or things that we used to create with the things that we would write, and we look back and we're like, oh man, that's so terrible. Like, I'm such a better writer now, or my politics are different now, or this and that. And my friend Safia Hilo, who's an amazing poet herself, always talks about how you have to look back at each poem or each memento or each thing you wrote, each thing you said, as a sort of time capsule of the moment that you were in at that time in your life. And how amazing is it to have this small morsel of who you were at a different period of time, so you can look back on that and observe and think about your growth. And I was like, man, that's such a more beautiful way of thinking about it than me looking back at my poems and being like, that's trash. So I am channeling my inner Sophia. But I'm going to read this poem, and I'm going to do something and talk about how I would have done written it a little bit differently if I were going to write it today. Memoir. Every year, my students read Night by Elie Wiesel. Following completion of the book, I assigned them the task of writing their own memoir. Maria came to America when she was 5 years old, wrote that she had to cross a river before she ever knew what it meant to swim, ran through knee-high grass as if the field were made of landmines, hid under the belly of trucks amid concrete and fertilizer so as not to leave a scent for the dogs. She did not know why she was running, but she knew that her mother cried every night for her father. She knew she was beginning to forget the outline of her daddy's face. She knew that he worked 18 hours a day just to provide them with food that they could barely find at home. She knew that he loved them and wanted to remember what it felt like to hold his daughter in his arms. But Maria was 5. She doesn't remember life in Mexico. She remembers kindergarten and sleepovers and middle school graduation. She is more American than any slice of apple pie, but that is not what we tell her. We punish Maria for just following directions, for being a child who is simply listening to her parents. We tell her parents they are wrong for wanting a better life for her family. We tell her that a 4.0 isn't good enough. We tell Maria that college wasn't meant for girls like her. We say too much brown skin. We say too much accent. We say, where'd you come from? We say you don't have a number, so you don't exist. There's apathy under the eyelids of this country, and we cannot see what's right in front of us. It's hard to convince someone to do well in school when the law tells them that it won't matter. When you're a number before you're a face. How convenient that we forget our own history. A country of immigrants who were once told we didn't belong. An assemblage of faces simply waiting for our country to see us. And so I wrote this in a moment in which I think this was when the DREAM Act was at the forefront of our conversations politically. And I just had a moment where I was like, man, if only that was what we were actually talking about now. Where the DREAM Act was at the forefront, immigration reform was at the forefront of our political consciousness. And a big strategy that so many immigration advocacy organizations use is, and I'm sure so many of you remember this, is that they would have the young people in caps and gowns, and they would go to the Capitol offices, the congressional offices, the Senate offices, state capitals. They would sit in the street, they would sort of lock arms, and it was this pretty stunning image of like all of these undocumented people, all of these dreamers as they would become to be known, in caps and gowns. And we were inundated with these stories of like this undocumented student graduated from Yale and is now working at NIH finding a cure for cancer. And this undocumented person graduated from Harvard Law School and is now a Supreme Court justice clerk. And this undocumented person, started an app that, reduced extreme poverty in the global South. And all of these amazing stories. And it was a tool that was largely deployed to say, like, look at what we would be losing if we sent these young people to a country that they never knew, if we kicked these young people out of our country. And I understand why it was done, and I think that I was very sympathetic and empathetic to it, and I think it made sense. It felt like it made sense at the time, but I think now a lot of immigration advocates will tell you, and my own thinking has shifted a bit, because what happens is when you inundate people with those images, it can seem as if you're implying that if you are not this exceptional person, and if you have not accomplished these exceptional things, that you are somehow unworthy of staying in this country. That you are somehow unworthy and aren't able to justify, staying in the United States, staying as a part of America. And I think about how there's a real harm that was done there in the ways that we sort of lifted up people as like good immigrants or bad immigrants, or like good undocumented people or bad undocumented people. And I think it's so unfair to so many of the young people and so many of these families. And I think how even that even translated into policy, where we had There were politicians who would say, we're going to work on, get rid of felons and not families. And we forget that the very idea of criminality is not a static, objective phenomenon, that it is a decision that people make. So I've been at Harvard the past 5 years, and I can tell you, if you go to any undergrad dorm on Harvard's campus, you will find a lot of drugs, you'll find a lot of people doing drugs, you'll find a lot of people selling drugs. Those kids never have to worry about the SWAT team coming up into their dorm rooms. Those kids never have to worry about police coming and checking and seeing what's in their drawers, in a way that kids who are black or brown or poor in different cities across this country have to worry about every single day. We're serving extended, long sentences in this country. And so I think we all have to be careful about the way we lift up. We use the language of criminality to suggest sort of character traits or character deficits around certain groups of people, and we forget that the same behavior can take place in two different scenarios, and one is called criminal and one is called like being a kid, coming of age, and learning and making mistakes. And so I think that, and I think also on the immigration front, what happens is, again, with the historical bent, we are not grounding the reason that, like, you cannot begin to understand why so many people from Central America and Mexico are coming to this country, have been arriving at the southern border, unless you understand like the decades and decades of US intervention and imperialism in those countries, right? That like the CIA literally went in and established a coup in Guatemala in 1954, right? And literally went in and is part of the reason that violence is as bad as it is in El Salvador. But we don't talk about that, right? And so we have this thing where America, goes into these countries and often economically and politically destabilizes them, and then people leave to try and find a better life. And then we blame them and somehow suggest that they are criminals or they are terrible people, they're not deserving of being here. And I think that parenthood has given me perspective in a lot of ways. And I think that people can come down politically on this conversation in a lot of different ways and disagree in good faith. But I can tell you, like, as the parent of a 17-month-old, like, there is no law, there is no border, there is no rhetoric, no person who could prevent me from trying to give my child a better and safer life if I felt like their life was in danger. And like, that has got to be what this conversation is about. And we like lose the human aspect of this so often. We lose the fact that these are kids and these are families, and that, the difference between an Irish farmer escaping famine in the 18th century and a woman escaping gang violence in El Salvador in the 21st century is that they both want safety for their families. They both want sanctuary. And I think we lose that in the ways that we attempt to like lift certain types of immigrants over others, or lift certain narratives over others. And so I think that's been shaping my thinking a lot. And I want to make sure that I'm more careful and more thoughtful in how I'm having these conversations. And so I'm going to do one more poem, and then I think we have time for, I'm going to do two more, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So this is my book. I'll be selling in the back if you are interested. Came out 2 years ago, and I remember when I first got it, I just kept touching it, and I was just like, and I rubbed it against my face, and I was like, oh my gosh, this feels so good. And I emailed my publisher, and I was like, what is the texture of this cover? Like, it just feels so good to touch. And he responded, and it was spelled M-A-T-T-E. And I was like, oh, mate. And my wife was like, no, honey, it's Matt. And I was like, that might be Matt, but this is Mate. This is what 7 years of French in school has gotten me, is that I just put random accents at the end of English words. But, so I've talked a lot about, over the past 45 minutes or so, about the kind of like historical violence that has been done to different communities, and how important it is to understand that in shaping the way that we think about our students, right? That like when a student comes into your office, they are carrying so much, whether they are cognizant or not of it. And it is so important for us to like keep that in mind so that we can maintain a level of patience with these students and with the young people that we work with. Because they deserve that, and we deserve to be reminded about the sort of larger forces that are shaping our work, or what our work looks like beyond us. But I always tell my students, it's important for you to know all of this stuff, because I think there's something emancipatory somebody, in being able to like name why the world looks the way that it does, and when the world tries to tell you that you are the reason you live the way you do, that if you have the intellectual toolkit with which to be like, actually no, I know the reason my community looks this way, or I know why you treat certain people this way, others that way. I think there's something deeply liberating and energetic that can free any person, but especially a young person, from the sort of paralysis that they might feel when they think that their condition or their lives are inevitable, or it is their destiny, where there's no opportunity to move away from that. And so I always tell them it's important to know that, but it's also important for you to remember that you are not singularly defined by the violence you experience. You are not singularly defined by your history. You are not singularly defined by the things that have attempted to kill you or to enact violence on you or your family. And that there are lots of moments of joy and celebration that you can write into. And I try to model that as I always do in these creative writing assignments. And so this came from a prompt where we were writing about specific moments in our lives that we look back fondly on, just as a sort of easier thing, and because they've been writing into so much of their trauma and different things, we need to remember the sort of fuller picture. And so my parents, there's this old school funk band called Maze and Frankie Beverly. And my parents used to dance together to their album in the kitchen, and it was like this ubiquitous fixture in my house. They danced together all the time. And when I was a kid, when I was little, they would start dancing together, and I'd be like, ew, that's nasty. I'm trying to sit here and eat my spaghetti, and y'all are over here doing whoop whoop. This is too much. And now I'm older, I have a wife, I have a son. And I was like, oh, they're just trying to keep the fire alive. I see. And so now when I go back home for Thanksgiving, and they start dancing and turn the music on, the lights get dim, I'm like, okay, I see what's going on here. I'm gonna take my spaghetti, go to the other room, y'all do what you gotta do, let me know when you're finished, and then we can come back. And so, but watching them dance was like a really joyous moment that I look back very fondly on in my childhood. And so this is a poem about my parents dancing together in the kitchen. When Maze and Frankie Beverly come on in my house, Mom's eyes close. She raises the spatula as if she were going to orchestrate the gumbo into existence, turns the knobs that we feel the bass thundering in the walls. At the start of verse 1, she points to Pops, walks over, shoulders oscillating back and forth between the melody. Pops does the same dance he's been doing since '73. Left knee, right knee, pop, snap. Left knee, right knee, pop, snap. It's like the universal old man dance. At the start of verse 2, Pops drops his shoulder, bites his bottom lip, and does some sort of spin move pivoting on his left foot. When he does this, it's unclear if he's hurt his back, or if he's doing an unauthorized version of the sprinkler. The way his hands flip and turn and slapbox the sky between them, the way Mom looks confused as to what exactly is happening, but she goes with it, because she's fly like that, and has never left Pops hanging on the dance floor. At the start of verse 3, smoke alarms are going off in the kitchen. Their hands are clasped now, fingers interlocked, swinging each other back and forth. Their feet are now music of their own. At the end of the song, Frankie's voice begins to fade, but they keep dancing. She holds her hand on the back of his neck. He pulls her in closer. She looks at him, kisses him between the sweat rolling down his forehead, and they laugh, and laugh, and laugh, and laugh, long after the song has stopped. All right, I'm gonna do this last poem, and then I think we have a few minutes for Q&A if people have questions. So you can probably tell that a lot of what shapes my work is this idea of speaking into the silences, speaking into the voids, whether it be historically or the injustices that we don't often talk about enough. And there was a big anti-bullying initiative in our school, and we were meant to go to our students and say, if you see something, say something. If there's physical abuse or emotional abuse, you're supposed to report it. Even if it's not affecting you or your friends, make sure you say something. And I was telling my students this, and I realized that there were so many moments in my own life that I wasn't doing what I was asking my students to do. And as a teacher, or anybody who works with young people, when you're asking your students to do something that you don't actually do yourself, it gives you this sort of icky, yucky, hypocritical feeling. And so I wrote this poem kind of as a means to hold myself accountable to be the type of person that I was asking my students to be. And so this is that poem. As a kid in a Catholic family in New Orleans, during Lent, I was always taught that the most meaningful thing one could do was to give something up. Sacrifice something you typically indulge in to prove to God you understand His sanctity. I've given up soda, McDonald's, French fries, French kisses, and everything in between. But one year, I gave up speaking. Figured the most valuable thing I could sacrifice was my own voice, but it was like I hadn't realized that I had given that up a long time ago. I spent so much of my life telling people the things they wanted to hear instead of the things they needed to. Told myself I wasn't meant to be anyone's conscience because I still had to figure out being my own, so sometimes I just wouldn't say anything, appeasing ignorance with my silence, unaware that validation doesn't need words to endorse its existence. When Christian was beat up for being gay, I put my hands in my pocket and walked with my head down as if I didn't even notice. Couldn't use my lock for weeks because the bolt on the lock reminded me of the one I put on my lips when the homeless man on the corner looked at me with eyes up, merely searching for an affirmation that he was worth seeing. I was more concerned with catching the screen of my apple than actually feeding him one. When the woman at the fundraising gala said, "I'm so proud of you. It must be so hard teaching those poor, unintelligent kids." I bit my lip because apparently we needed her money more than my students needed their dignity. We spend so much time listening to the things people are saying that we rarely pay attention to the things they don't. Silence is the residue of fear. It's filling your flaws. Gut-wrench guillotine your tongue is the air, retreating from your chest because it doesn't feel safe in your lungs. Silence is Rwandan genocide. Silence is Katrina. It is what you hear when there aren't enough body bags left. It is the sound after the noose is already tied. It is charring. It is chains. It is privilege. It is pain. There is no time to pick your battles when your battles have already picked you. I will not let silence wrap itself around my indecision. I will tell Christian he is a lion, a sanctuary of bravery and brilliance. I will ask that homeless man what his name is and how his day was, because sometimes all people want to be is human. I will tell that woman, and my students talk about transcendentalism like their last name was Thoreau. And just because you watch one episode of The Wire doesn't mean you know anything about my kids. So this year, instead of giving something up, I will live every day as if there were a microphone tucked under my tongue, a stage on the underside of my inhibition. Because who has to have a soapbox when all you ever needed is your voice? So I know that this is the end of the day. I'm sure you all have to get home soon. But if you have any questions, I think we have a few minutes, like 5 minutes or so. Yes?
A couple of questions. One is, and you may not have the answers, but I just kind of want to get your input. We hardly ever talk about slavery in the U.S. and the fact that he wasn't right. We kind of ignore that part of history and move forward. So now really discussing slavery makes us kind of feel like it never happened, but it did happen. And somehow or another, it looks like it's correct. So the first question is, how do you, I guess, view, or how would you help us kind of be able to discuss that openly? That's one of the questions. Another question is, in the right movement, you know, it seems like we do 2 steps forward, but then 2 steps back. And the same issues that we're having back in the 60s, 70s, or late 60s, are the same issues that we're having right now. It's just that the actors are different. And how do you help us as an institution or a group of different institutions move forward and not kind of go back in time and have those steps back and be in the same place, I would say 20 years from now, where we don't really address a lot of things that happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that your first question speaks to your second. I mean, I think part of the reason that we aren't able to consistently move forward is because we have a myopic, misconstrued narrative of like how we arrived at that moment in the first place. And so when you don't understand the basic fundamentals of the history of slavery, then you are unable to understand why like large swaths of the American population lives in the conditions that it does, or that why certain parts of the country are more poor than others. And I think, I said it, I'll say it again, but like in 1860, David Blight, who's a historian at Yale, he writes about this. The 4 million black slaves were worth more than every single bank, factory, and railroad combined, right? And that 6% of the population was responsible for 80% of the economic output, right? So it is not, we know why we are a global economic superpower is because we had 250 years of free labor. from huge groups of people. And then we have to, like, part of what people need to remember, I think, too, is that, like, slavery started in the United States, so to speak. First slaves arrived in 1619. We didn't become a country till 1776, officially. When you think about the arc of history and the arc of time, what I always try to remind people is that, like, when 1863 came, and Abraham Lincoln was considering the Emancipation Proclamation, 1865, I think we look back at certain people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and, you know, Abraham Lincoln, and all these folks, and we're like, oh, well, we would have been just like that, right? We would have been on the right side of history. Clearly, slavery is wrong. This is not okay. I would have been an abolitionist. We would have fought for freedom, da-da-da-da. I think we forget that, like, that was by far the minority of people in this country who were considering that and then also openly advocating that. The United States had never existed without the institution of slavery alongside it. So when people were like, we need to end slavery, most people looked at those folks like they were crazy. They were like, this is all we've ever, it literally was all that generation upon generation upon generation of people have ever known. And I say that to your question because I think we have this thing where we fail to, like, understand how things were transpiring at that moment. And so then we project ourselves into those moments and we think we know how we would act in those moments. And in the same way that, like, generations from now, our grandkids will look back and be like, man, in 2018, I'll tell you what I would have done. I definitely wouldn't have let X, Y, Z happen, or I definitely wouldn't have just saw, you know, what was happening on the news. But it's so different when you're in it. And it's so different, you get consumed in the inertia. And part of it is that, like, you have to live, you gotta work, you have kids to take care of, you have bills to pay. And so it is difficult to remove yourself enough to understand the historical import of that time period you're in to become the sort of activist that you would have imagined. I think that's an important empathic exercise for us to do, not with our students, but with everybody, right? Where we remind ourselves that we don't have to wait for a moment to say, I would have done, to look back on and say, like, I would have done this when this happened. Because so many of those things, as you say, are still happening right now. Like, this is that moment, right? And that's why I try to emphasize to my students, they're like, oh, like, you know, if I wouldn't have let anybody do what they did to me in slavery, or I wouldn't have let, you know, Jim Crow, I would have never let that happen, or what they did to Chinese railroad workers, never would have, you know, all of these different things. I'm like, this is that moment. So many people are doing things to different communities and different populations that you look in your history books and say, I wouldn't have let that happen. And so I think the reason that we take steps forward and steps back is because people aren't able to situate themselves in the moment and recognize the sort of political urgency that their own actions, that necessitate, you know, actions from them. You know, and so much of my scholarship is focused on the history of slavery and like, I mean, like, it was just, no institution in the history of the world has existed like that. People will say, oh, well, Greece had slavery, or other parts of Africa had slavery. There is no other society in the history of the world that had intergenerational lineages of enslaved people. If you usually what would happen is you fought a war and you enslaved someone. You had the people you captured, prisoners of war, and then they were your slave, and they were your slave until they died. And you know, and then sometimes their kids integrated into the sort of larger society, you know, in Greco-Roman culture, that's how it is. Like, this is the only society ever exist in which you were, like, your parents and your grandparents and their parents could all have been born into slavery. And I think that's a particular sort of, like, insidious violence, to have people who have never known anything looking forward or looking back that resembles freedom. And I just think we have to be more, I mean, I can go on and on about this because I think about this all the time, but, like, you have to be frank about it. We have to be frank with what it was. It was like genocidal torture of millions and millions of people, of children, and I think that, you know, I'm writing a book right now thinking about this and thinking about how we talk about or don't talk about certain facets of American history. And I spent time at Monticello Plantation. And you, like, walk into the living quarters of an enslaved person, like, and you think about a dozen people would sleep in a room that's this big. Like, I just don't think we do the empathic exercises enough to really, like, imagine what our kids or us and what that would look like. So I'm going to stop because I would just keep going otherwise. But. One or two more questions?
What role do you see voting as playing in speaking to the silent?
Please vote. Every single person in this room, please vote. I can give you my answer when I'm still on their time, and then I can give you my political, personal answer at the table.
With regards to getting the young vote.
Yeah, I think you have to give people something to vote for. I think there are a lot of things to vote against in this moment, but I think we forget the power of what it means to have inspiring messages and inspiring candidates. You have to have people who obviously I don't know the political orientations of everyone in this room, but if you think, just in the context of Obama, he got so many young people to vote because they were excited about someone for the first time in their lives and what he was running on. And I think that you have different candidates on both political spectrums who are galvanizing and energizing young people in a different way. But I mean, you have to have someone who can speak to things that matter to them. I mean, for example, I think about how so many of my students decide not to go to college because they're like, why would I take on hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt to go get this degree that is not even guaranteed to give me certain opportunities that it's that I'm told it will give me. And I think that you're seeing more and more people run on whether it be canceling or reducing student loan payments, and I mean just things that affect young people every single day. So yeah, I think you meet them where they are and you ask them. I think a lot of young people just feel like they're not taken seriously in the electoral process, and that because older voters traditionally vote more consistently, that all the pollsters and all the consultants tell their campaigns to focus on those voters rather than so many of the young voters who otherwise might care if you gave them a reason to care. I'm going to do one more, and then I'm going to go to the back. Okay, all good. Well, I'll be in the back if you're interested in the book or just want to say hello, please come say hi. I also have the credit card swipey thing, and so if you're like, man, what Clint said was really moving, that was so great, you can come in the back. Or if you're like, man, Clint has a lot of diapers to buy, you can also come in the back. I'm just kidding. But thank you all so much.
One of the things that I wanted to mention was, Clint, I actually watched your TED Talk before we got you on. And one of the things that was real powerful to me was just saying hi to people and what an impact that makes. So hopefully today you can say hi to somebody you don't know, somebody you don't typically would just have a camaraderie with. So hopefully you do that. I'm going to go ahead and let Steve close this out, but I just want to say thank you so much for being here today. I know it was a long day, but hopefully it was beneficial to you. This is something that we want to continue, our tradition of doing this every year. Hopefully, I think we're going to try to do it maybe midway, maybe in Arroyo Grande, Pismo Beach area next year. What do you guys think about that? Yeah. Would you guys be okay with that? On the beach, Manuela? On the beach? At the cliffs? So I was just thinking of request to folks because I know that we were thinking somewhere midpoint, but just we're still playing with it. We're still playing with it. We may have to bus you over. We can bring you. I'll pick you up. We got you. So I want to go ahead and let Steve close us out, and thank you so much for being here today.